Alright, so we've got our frame. This is our bottom plate here. Let's find our top plate is floating around right over here. And then we've got all of the hardware for the frame here. Now this is a little clear acrylic, I don't know, some sort of case to or some sort of lid to a case that I got. I think it was from when I replaced my phone screen. But a lot of things that you are buying, a lot of products that you're buying come with these nice, the Emax motors come with nice little plastic boxes and stuff. Now save one or two of these. Don't become a hoarder, but a great build tip is to keep a little tray like this around so you can easily, all of your parts, your little nuts and bolts and stuff, they're inside of something. They're not bouncing around. You're not sliding them across the table. They're not getting mixed up in all of your other hardware. It's really nice to have something like that sitting around. So we're gonna go ahead and start assembling the frame. So on the Falcon 130, the way that we're gonna build it up, we've got our longer screws here. These are going to go in the bottom of the frame. They're going to thread up through the PDB, or they're going to thread up through the bottom plate. They're going to thread up through the spacer. The battery strap will be under there. They'll thread up through the PDB. They'll go through the other space, or another line of spacers, and then they'll go through the flight controller. And on top of that, they'll sit these red standoffs here, and then you'll have sort of the rest of the build in the space between those red standoffs and the top plate. So to assemble this, there's also a really great set of instructions that LASD has put together on the Falcon 130 site, but we'll just kind of walk through it here. So you're going to put your 4 screws in the bottom plate. And then we're putting these really thin little 1/2 millimeter, I think they're some sort of like paper or something like that. I'm not really sure what kind of material they are. They're just little tiny spacers. And what these do is keep your PDB off of the frame just high enough that it doesn't short out. And it's kind of a little bit scary, but it actually works perfectly. So then on top of that, we're going to go ahead and put our PDB. Now you want to make sure that you're paying attention to which direction that the frame goes. In most cases, with a couple of other X-frames that I've used, they've had the battery strap slots on either side. Luckily on the Falcon 130, or at least this rendition of it, it has the exact same cutouts on all 4 sides and it's perfectly symmetrical, so it doesn't really matter. So we'll go ahead and call this the front of the frame. Alright, so once you've got all of that on there, the next thing that you're going to do is put on your PDB. Now in our case, we're using a PDB and an OSD built together. So I'm actually going to take a moment and de-pin this guy because I don't want these pins hanging off the back of the frame. If I were to set this on here like this, you can see that those are popping out. And these are the pins for, I believe, the VTX connection, which would be really nice if we are running a build where we intend on swapping out VTXs sort of on the fly. But in any case that you want to do that, you just kind of rig something like a JST connector or something of that nature in the middle between your PDB or your OSD and your VTX. For this build, we're not going to be doing any kind of hot swappability, leaving that in there, because even if we did, we'd have to put a connector for this on the back of the new VTX if we had to hot swap it in the field anyways. So we're just going to go ahead and de-pin that really quickly. So the best way I've found to de-pin something is to actually remove this little plastic spacer here. These guys are really annoying and they just hold all your pins together, which you actually don't want when you're de-pinning, which may sound obvious because you can't take all of them out at once. You'd have to heat all 3 little hot solder pads up. So these guys usually just melt apart or break apart anyway, so I just pull them off with a pair of pliers. And then you go ahead and put it in your helping hands, and then you heat it up pin by pin and pull it out with some tweezers or something. Alright, so while we've got our PDB kind of in the helping hands and in our attention and everything, we're going to go ahead and set up both our power leads here. I actually switched it out to some smaller leads because we're using the XT30s. So this guy uses some smaller wire there, if you can see the little connectors. So we're going to use this stuff. This is just a trimming off of the ESC. Now something I like to do is make my cuts very deliberately on all of my components, so that way you wind up with like extra lengths of nice silicone wire or something off of your ESCs or whatever that you can reuse in other places of the build, and then you're not spending money on superfluous materials that you already have lying around and you're just tossing anyways. So we'll wire up the XT30 in just a second here, but first we're going to go ahead and tin all of the pads that we're going to be using on the OSD and PDB. We'll go ahead and get the power negative set up for the ESCs with just a nice little nice little line of solder running down them, and then do all of these OSD connections up here on the top. So in retrospect, we're actually not going to go ahead and tin up these guys here for the OSD. I'd rather leave a few of them so that I can actually run the wires into the hole and then solder around it. That'll be a lot more convenient in the long run, I think, rather than tinning them up and then having to heat the pad and then hit the get the wire into the melted solder. It's a lot easier to do it sort of the other way around. It does look like we need to go ahead and hit our 5-volt here, and then the ground is actually just grounded to here. So this 5-volt here is where we're going to run our flight controller off of. Alright, then we'll go ahead and ground the pads for our batteries here. Alright, so we got our PDB all primed up, obviously minus the OSD ports over here. We're going to leave those open, like I said. So this is ready to go onto the frame, I believe. Now if you look in the back of the power OSD, you can see that there are pads there, and if you short that, it actually puts this OSD into the PAL mode. If you leave it open, it puts it into the NTSC mode. This little CCD camera, sorry, that the little micro cam. If we look at the case here, it says that it is, if it'll focus, now if we look at the case here, it says that it is PAL. So I'm going to go ahead and bridge these two little pads here. I'm just going to do it with a little bit of solder, and that way the board will be in PAL, the camera will be in PAL, everything will kind of be consistent with each other. Even though we're in the US, we'll just kind of leave everything together. Alright, so now as you can see, we have a very, very slight amount of solder there bridging the two pads. Now what I actually did is put a healthy amount of solder onto the two pads and made sure that they were bridged, and then I took my flush cutters here and my edge cutters or straight cutters or whatever you call them, and I actually trimmed it down, because remember, we're using a 0.5 millimeter spacer there between the PDB and the frame, and there'll also be a battery strap that I think will run right down the middle here and cover this up. But just to be safe, we kept everything as low profile as possible. Nice clean little bridge there, so that was pretty easy. So we're gonna go ahead and solder sucker out these 3 holes here, just so when we're ready to wire up the camera to the OSD, that'll be good to go, and then we'll go ahead and put the PDB down on the board. Alright, so well, that's close enough. I'm not going to spend too much time trying to get that out of there. I think it'll wire through just fine as it is. So our PDB is pretty much ready now. It's all primed. We have it shorted out so that it's all in PAL mode, even though we're in the US. Again, we wanted it to stay. Oh no. Oh, this is annoying. So we're going to go ahead and put our battery leads on just so that we can trim off any of the wire that actually goes through the board, because again, 0.5 millimeter spacers, so we don't want anything to make contact with the actual carbon fiber frame. So we're going to wire these on, and we're going to go ahead and solder these on and set up our XT30 connectors, and then trim that all back, and then we'll be ready to put the PDB and OSD onto the board here. So for wire stripping, I always just use these guys. They're just your standard little edge cutters or straight cutters, flush cutters, whatever you want to call them. Now the power leads are actually where you really want to make sure that you have a decent soldering iron. I had a hell of a time trying my darndest to utilize a $10 iron that I had laying around from just my local electronics store or something of that nature. That's probably not your best idea. I caved quickly and I wound up getting just a cheap iron. It's nothing super fancy. It's only about $30 or so, but it is just night and day, even just having a fairly decent iron. It's not even anything super expensive, so can't recommend it enough. And you'll see that as I solder these larger gauge wires with all the larger pads that need to heat up to make a nice solid connection, that it's just super important to have something that is up to the task. So we've got our positive lead on, and you always want to make sure to give those a nice good tug. Your battery is always going to get tossed. You're going to need to have a strong enough solder here on the board that will outlast the force that it takes to pull apart your XT30s, because otherwise your force is going to be coming, pulling your wires out there. I've had that happen a couple times to myself. It's not the prettiest thing ever. So be a little liberal with your solder. Make sure you've got a nice solid joint. Give it a good tug here. These are really, really important joints to have really well. You have soldered really well. Go ahead and do our negative lead here. I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of extra soldering on the bottom of this board here, just to make sure that this connection is really strong. I don't want these leads being pulled out in the field when a battery gets tossed. Alright, so our positive or negative leads are on here. They're on nice and secure. You can give them a good tug. Now again, we're using 0.5 millimeter spacers here, so we're going to go ahead and trim everything on the back side of this board that's sticking through. You can see the solder and a little bit of wire. We're going to use our flush cutters and trim it just as smoothly as we can, because again, using these thin spacers, we don't want to have any risk of anything contacting the frame. Especially the positive and negative leads directly. That would just be pretty bad. Alright, so we've got these trimmed down pretty flush here. Now we'll make sure to go ahead and put some electrical tape over the back of this board just to be triply sure that nothing is going to contact on these open pads here when you put it on the frame. So with that being said, we're ready to put the OSD/PDB onto the frame. So you can actually choose if you want to put this OSD facing forwards or backwards here at this point in time. The advantage of putting it facing forwards would be that your camera connections here for the OSD and your VTX are actually closer to the front where your camera's at, but the downside is that then you have to route these large power leads all the way through your frame, and with such a small and tight build, that's obviously not optimal. So we're going to flip this backwards and run the power connectors out the power leads here right out the back, and then we'll just run a small cable from the back of the OSD to the front to reach the camera. That'll be pretty simple and straightforward. I think it's not going to cause too much trouble. Now, having built a Falcon 130 and a Falcon 185 and something of a third Falcon that was sort of a mix of a couple extra plates that I had laying around, I've learned to go ahead and put some of these nylon nuts on here. Now, while you're working on this frame, you're obviously going to be picking it up and handling it, and every darn time I've lifted the thing up, the screw here that's running up through the bottom plate and the PDB and the spacer has come out, and that's gone flying onto the floor wherever, just laying on the bench, and then the spacer underneath it comes out, and then you have to line it all up again because you have to do 4 at once, and you've got a PDB on there, and everything just gets really annoying. So a very helpful tip whenever you're working on something like this is to use a temporary nylon nut here like this to hold everything in place, because now you can pick it up, handle, you can flip it upside down, and nothing's going to go flying. So for our power leads, we're obviously going to route them down here coming out the back, and there are little cutouts here on all 4 sides of the frame. The one in the back is actually pretty great for zip tying these two leads down here, and that gives you kind of a mechanical connection between there to stop the battery from actually tugging on your solder joints, and it gives you something else holding the lines in place other than just solder, which is really nice. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll go ahead and do that closer to the end, because we want everything to be sort of loosey-goosey and ready to work on at any point in time. And if we have to take this off and reach the bottom of the board for some reason, or flip it over or something like that, then it's a lot easier to do that before we zip tie everything down. So, alright, our PDB is looking good so far. Let's go ahead and wire on our battery lead here. We'll put our XT30 onto the end of these 2 leads here. Now, like I said, these guys are great because of their size. They're about half the size of an XT60, which by the numbers makes a lot of sense. So you can see here, in comparison to the frame, when we're going for a sub 250 gram build, obviously it's not going to be a huge difference in weight. Neither of these really weigh anything, but this is pretty large and unwieldy compared to the size of the frame here. The only annoyance to using an XT30 is that your pair boards probably only have XT60 connectors, so you're going to have to make a few adapters. Just order a set of 5 males and a set of 5 females, make an adapter for yourself, and then you're able to quickly plug everything into the exact same pair board that you're already using and charge all of your smaller batteries that are set up to use the XT30s. So we'll go ahead and get this set up here. Now, we don't want too long of a power lead coming off the bottom of this, because all it needs to do is route right to the bottom here where you're going to have a battery anyways. So judging off that, we'll go ahead and snip these right around this area. Now, keep in mind also that you're going to be zip tying this to the frame to make that mechanical connection and relieve the stress in your solder joints when you're crashing and tossing your battery. So we're going to go ahead and leave just a little bit longer than I would think that you would. By the time that this is inside of, by the time this is zip tied down and inside here, you'll be able to route your battery lead right to here, and this will just barely be able to bend, which is kind of where I like to have it. So rule number 1 when soldering, for the sake of your own time, is to always make sure to put your heat shrink on before you actually solder. Can't tell you the number of times I've forgotten to do that one. So annoying to have to undo everything that you've just done and redo it over again, because then none of your connections and stuff are quite as clean as they were on the first go, because you have that extra solder residue laying around from your first attempt. Now, we're going to be heating these wires pretty significantly because we're soldering them into these XT30 connectors, so make sure to run your heat shrink down as far as you can. We don't have much leeway on this guy because, well, there's not a very long battery lead, so kind of unfortunate, but hopefully the heat shrink doesn't start shrinking on us too early from the heat that we're running through the wire. So to tin your battery leads, or tin your wire, just as you always would. And kind of pretty liberally flow some solder down into these connectors here. Now generally I like to do this in the reverse order, and you actually do your XT30 onto these wires before you solder it onto here, but for some reason I did it backwards this time. So the advantage of putting the XT30 onto your cables before you solder into the PDB is that now when we're going to heat this up to put the XT30 on there, we run the risk of heating it up so much that the heat shrink inside of this starts melting at the bottom here. That is just kind of be annoying, because then we won't be able to thread it down, obviously. So we'll see how this goes, but it doesn't really make any difference which order you do things in, but you may want to reverse this if you've watched this, if you're not following along and are going to do your build after you're watching this. Alright, so both these wires are seated inside of those pretty firmly, inside of the little slots in the XT30. You can see I'm giving it a good tug, a good twist and everything, and it's not going to come undone there. That's looking pretty good, so we'll go ahead and let this cool down, and then we'll pull the heat shrink up and actually shrink over these little exposed solders points here, because you don't want to leave those sitting out there. Go ahead and get the heat gun out in a little bit here, but we're going to let this cool down, because if you actually pull these up the wire too soon, this has actually got a decent bit of heat. It's not hot to the touch, but it's certainly warm enough to actually start making the heat shrink, which is super annoying to have to cut that down once the end of it is already taut on there. So yeah, heat shrink aside, so this is our PDB set up and ready to go. We've got our power lead on here. Again, we'll zip tie this down after the fact, so we have just this nice little stubby lead coming out the back here. So let's go ahead and move along, and we'll start on our motors and ESCs and getting those attached to the frame, and then we'll get those attached to the PDB.